All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about winemaking basics, featuring a little bit of the viticulture side of winemaking. And this is for the 308 winemaking class. So, winemaking at its simplest. Honestly, any type of fruit will ferment on its own and form alcohol. But for making wine, you take grapes, you can add yeast or not, you let it ferment, right? And then you remove the solids, also known as pumice, and then you drink the wine. So if you just wanted to make a bucket of wine in your garage and just do it in the most basic of basic ways, it can be done. Can't guarantee be very good, but wine on its own is kind of a self-facilitated process in a lot of ways. And where we come in with the winemaking is when some quality stuff happens and we can make a really high-end product. So all over kind of a very broad sense of making wine, it's just the process of converting sugar into alcohol by fermenting wine grapes specifically. So for white wine, we'll receive grapes, crush, destem, and press, ferment the juice, then fine and filter. It's a very broad sense. We're gonna add a couple more steps in there, like racking for the class. We did process the Sauvignon Blanc last week, which was awesome. Not every winery will crush and destem the grapes before pressing it. We're just doing that for our class because our press is very inefficient and we need to crush open those grapes so we can get the most yield of juice possible. So for a lot of wineries, they'll just receive the grapes and then do a whole cluster press, then ferment the juice and then go from there. So that's what makes a white wine. It's the removal of juice from those skins immediately, so that way you can just ferment the juice and have a clear white product at the end. For a red wine, we'll receive the grapes, crush and destem. Crushing and destemming is a very common process for red wines. There are some varieties and styles that will do a whole cluster fermentation, but that's different. Anyways, either way, you will ferment with the skins, and you're going to extract all those colors and flavors and aromas, and that's what creates a red wine. Then you'll press, ferment it again, and this is what we call secondary fermentation or malolactic fermentation. We'll go through this in much more detail in an entire lecture. Then age, fine, and filter as well. So I do have a couple videos on here for you guys to see. It was a little YouTube video about how wine is made, and then we also have an article from Wine Magazine, how red wine is made. So I definitely check out this YouTube video. It's linked here. It's just a little cartoon that goes over what it looks like during the winemaking process. But we'll see it firsthand in class too. So a couple different things. If you're going to start making wine or you want to be a winemaker on a commercial scale, there's a couple of things that you have to ask yourself. And some of those are really up to the company that you end up working for, because they might already have a brand and something in mind for their wine. So you might just be taking over kind of their standard operations. But if you are to start your own business today and have complete creative freedom, these are the things that you'd want to ask yourself. What kind of wine do I want to make? What do I want it to cost? How much money you put into this product means you're going to need to charge more for it ultimately. What characteristics do I want or not want? Do I want it to be fruity? Do I want it to be earthy, high alcohol, low alcohol? Those are all things to consider. What are the risks? Can I and do I want to control them? Spoilage, if you go through a native fermentation, you're much more likely to go through some kind of spoilage contaminant, but it is very possible, and when it's done correctly, it's done very well. Flavor consequences of each decision. Am I going to add oak? Did I add too much oak? Is it going to cover up the wine? Things like that. Are these flavors desirable or undesirable in the final wine? All things that you'll have to ask yourself when you're a winemaker. So every decision that we make is kind of a chain reaction, and there's multiple components to think about when making wine. Like you could decide that you want to add oak. Then you have to decide what type of oak you want to add, how much you want to add. Do you want to add more than one type? Is it right for that wine? Is it right for that style? Is it going to interact with high alcohol? Is it going to help cover some vinegar components in your wine? Are you going to add residual sugar? How is that going to affect the mouthfeel? So all sorts of things go into it, and it becomes very complex ultimately, but we try not to just make decisions. We try to think about what are the consequences of my decisions, and also, is the consumer going to enjoy this, and is this going to sell? Because at the end of the day, a winery is a business, and it pays the bills for a lot of people. So all things to think about. Unless you're just making it for fun at home, then you can do whatever you want. So where does the wine flavor come from? So what gives wines the flavor of citrus or cherry or tobacco? Like, do we add these things to the wine? No, we don't. It's a very common question in the tasting room. We do not add these things to the wine. We're not out here unrolling cigars and throwing them in tanks, or grating fresh lemon zest in one of our white wine tanks. We're not doing that. So where all these flavors come from 4 different components. So it comes from the grape itself. So it depends on the variety, right? So Pinot Noir versus Tempranillo versus Cab, they're all going to come with their own flavors because of the skin, right? The skin's where that comes from. Number 2 is activity of microorganisms. So the type of fermentation that you did, the type of the yeast and bacteria that you chose, whether it was native fermentation or not. Number 3 is processing choices. So did you decide to do a cold soak before fermentation? Did you do an extended maceration? Did you do a carbonic maceration? Did you decide to co-ferment things together, hot fermentation, cold fermentation? Anyways, all these processing choices, all these man-made decisions really affect the style and the flavor of the wine as well. And also number 4 is aging. With that comes any type of, whether you aged it in a barrel, how long you aged it for, the temperature of aging, all that fun stuff. So we'll go through all of these individually. But those are the 4 components that determine the flavor of a final wine. I put a big star on the slide because this will be a big question on your quiz. I'll most likely ask you to know all 4 of these components and also write a little quick summary of what each one is. So I'll be prepared to talk about that. I always love having this in the slideshow because whether you work in a tasting room or you are going to be a winemaker, this is a really big question a lot of people ask, and so it's really nice when you can answer it. So it's good to know. So flavor is from the grape itself. So the variety itself is going to determine most of the flavors, right? So like I said, if it's a Pinot Noir, Tempranillo, Cab, Pinot Grigio, etc., the grape itself will set the baseline for that. So within that, there's also like clones. Different clones have different subtleties and flavors. Rootstocks, soils, your canopy management, the terrain that the grapevines are grown on, whether it's a desert or it's subtropical or Mediterranean, pest pressures, disease pressures, climate is a huge one. There's lots of cluster microclimates as well. So if it's humid around the cluster and within the canopy, you can get mold and mildew. And so this is right here, this is called botrytis, also known as noble rot, which we'll learn more about. Sometimes this is desirable in a style of wine, and sometimes it is not. So those are things that can happen and can affect the flavors of the wine. Also, seasonal variations, every vintage is going to be different, and also your vineyard practices are going to affect that as well. So that's just the grape itself. And this is really the baseline for what a lot of French winemakers would call terroir. So really a sense of place, the soil, the terrain, all the plants that are growing around it. This is all going to affect the flavor of the wine. All right, activity of microorganisms. So we're talking about yeast and bacteria here. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the most prominently used yeast in wine, beer, and the baking industry. It's believed to originate from grape skin. So this is a native yeast that started on grapes out in the wild. Then over time, we started to breed these yeasts and create super yeasts that are very effective and can, and can ferment at high alcohol levels, withstand that level of alcohol, and much, much more. And this is a really cool branch of science where people from all over the world take isolates of yeast from grapevines and then breed them to make like a super yeast. But so for example, like today, you could buy, there's probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of yeast that you could buy from to use for your wine and other cooking projects. You can get an isolate yeast from Spain that came from Spain, and now they've bred it in a lab and they sell it on a commercial basis. Yeast from Italy, yeast that are specialized for Bordeaux varieties, all these fun things. And anyways, it's a very cool part of the industry. So yeast selection is huge. It can determine the final alcohol of your wine, like how tolerant they are to alcohol, the specific flavors that they utilize and bring out, whether it brings forward more floral characteristics or bright fruit, it helps with mouthfeel, all these things. So yeast is a very huge component of what the wine will taste like at the end. We also have lactic acid bacteria, and this is generally not great if depending on the type of lactic acid bacteria that you're using. But so this kind of falls under the secondary fermentation area where converting malic to lactic acid. But this can also ferment glucose into lactic acid, which makes wine taste like sour milk, or basically turns it into vinegar. So not fantastic when it does that. So there's kind of a way to keep yeast and bacteria at bay. There's a whole microbiological component to wine that you'll have to understand as well, and we'll get into that in more detail. But anyways, so we have grape flora, winery flora, and then also the yeast that you choose to inoculate, the inocula yeast as well. So if you decided to just harvest grapes and bring them in to ferment, they would have a flora of native yeast and bacteria already on them. And same thing with your winery, depending on how clean your winery is and what yeast and bacteria have been used in there. There's already a flora within your winery as well that exists. It just lives on the tanks, it lives in the drains in the floor, and then So folks that do native fermentations have a lot to be proud of, because that speaks very loudly about how clean their facility is. So awesome. So processing decisions impacting wine character. So this could be the conditions at harvest. Also your maceration choices, so time spent with the grape skin. So you could, like I said, do a cold soak, which is like a pre-fermentation soak of the grapes within the juice with some dry ice, keeping it very cold so it doesn't ferment. So it'll start to extract flavors and aromas from the skin before it starts to ferment. You could also, for extraction conditions, so this is kind of talking about a hot fermentation versus cold fermentation. That'll give you very different results for your wine as well. Whatever additions you make to the juice / must. Must is just the fancy term for when grapes have been crushed and destemmed. It's must, or it's actively fermenting. That's known as must. Fermentation conditions, lees contact. So as you can see in this bottle, it's on its side. You see this little film of lees on the bottom. So that is the yeast and bacteria that's left after fermentation that settles out. If you leave it on that, it'll help improve mouthfeel, give it a really creamy texture. So that will affect what the wine tastes like. Clarification, filtration and fining. So what you remove from the wine, blending and stabilization treatments, these will all impact what your final product will be. These are all very kind of, like I said, the man-made decisions where the winemaker intervenes to start the processing decisions. Awesome. Aging decisions are pretty straightforward. So how long you age your wine, right? It gets softer and smoother the longer it ages, but it also starts to lose some of that fruitiness, so it's going to affect the wine. The temperature of aging, the cooperage, what type of oak you're using, the pH of the wine will have a huge impact of how it will age, the wine composition in general, the rate of evaporation as the wine ages, agitation, oxygen exposure, lees exposure, and also sanitation practices. So these will all affect how your wine ages and the trajectory of what your wine's going to taste like, for better or worse. So what this guy's doing here, and what this little picture is called topping. So even though a wine barrel holds a seal, it does evaporate over time depending on the temperature of storage. It naturally kind of diffuses through the pores of the barrel. So what will happen, and that's also known as the angel's share. So if you guys ever go on wine tours or you want to give a fun fact to a friend, the wine that evaporates as it's aging is called the angel's share. And then I personally like to joke that any wine that's spilled down the drains or any money paid in taxes to the government is called the devil's cut. But I made up that second part, so that's not textbook. So anyways, as the wine evaporates, this gentleman's going back and he's refilling the barrels to get rid of that space of oxygen in the barrel. So oxygen will cause wine to lose its freshness, lose its fruitiness, and also affect the color of the wine. So to keep it fresh and fruity and keep it from spoiling, you'll have to top the barrel. So he's refilling it, then he'll put the bung back and it will be good to go. This is a barrel of sherry, and so it has this glass or very industrial hard plastic pane so you can see into it. So this is a white wine that's been aged, and this film of yeast that you see up here, this is called flor, F-L-O-R, flor yeast. And what it's doing is it's actually breaking down oxygen and alcohol within the wine and producing sherry-like aromas. So caramel, butterscotch, and kind of like oxidized flavors. That is what that style of wine is. So that is wanted for sherry wines, but not wanted if you're creating just a standard dry red. So this is what we're trying to prevent by topping. This is a situation where it's done on purpose to create this style of wines. They want this gap of oxygen so this yeast can thrive. Cool. Okay, so that's kind of just a very general winemaking. We're going to dive way deeper into this, obviously, throughout the rest of the semester, but now we're going to kind of move into the viticulture component. So how does the vineyard affect everything that we do? So just a very baseline information of viticulture. What type of vines do we use? Generally, we use Vitis vinifera, which are European grape varieties. We use these because they make good wine, quite frankly. The Native American varieties that we found here in the United States were not fantastic. They are very cold resistant and disease resistant, so we have to use them for the rootstocks of vines here. And that's Vitis labrusca, Riparia, Vitis rotundifolia. These are American grape varieties. So because they handle the pests and the weather conditions that are from here, America, the United States, we use them for rootstocks, and then we actually have to graft European varieties on the top because they produce the fantastic fruit for wine that we enjoy so much. So that's kind of a general view of what's going on there. There are some very common rootstocks in the industry that don't always have names per se, so they'll be called 10114, 1103P, 3309. So if you hear winemakers and viticulturists talk about rootstocks, they might be spouting out numbers, and that's totally normal. It's just what the rootstocks are called when they're bred to be a certain way. Cool. Another really important thing to know is the difference between a variety and a clone. So new varieties are created by sexual reproduction, right? There's two parents and they produce an offspring. So a great example of that is Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. Those are the parents of Cabernet Sauvignon. So to make that cross, they take the female parts of one plant, and then they take the pollen or the male parts from the other plant, and they fertilize. Then when those grapes produce seeds, they take those seeds and they plant them, and then you have like the genetic, Punnett square, kind of like the Darwin situation where all these vines grow, and now there's been a genetic DNA crossing of these two different vines, and now you can see what type of wines those vines make, and see if you like it, it's to your favor. So that's all that a lot of breeding goes for grapevines, and UC Davis has a lot of breeding programs and a lot of studies trying to find new varieties and what's best, what has the best yield, what's mildew resistant, what's cold hardy, all those fun things. So that is a new variety. A whole new variety is created by sexual reproduction, and this gets tricky because grapevines on their own are naturally hermaphroditic. They have male and female parts, so they self-fertilize. So that's why you have to carefully trim off all of the pollen components of one vine and then take the pollen components of another to cross. That's why you don't see that a lot in nature. You don't see a lot of new varieties being made necessarily on their own because they'll just repollinate themselves. On the other hand, we have clones. So if you are a fan of Pinot Noir, let's just say Pinot Noir and every variety has a lot of clones. So there could be, Pinot Noir A, B, and C. Let's just say, for example, I don't know what the actual names are. So one could be more fruity, one could be more earthy, and one could have a much lower yield than a popular or typical Pinot Noir. So what happens is clones are created by mutations. And there's a couple different definitions here. We'll start with the mutation thing. So how does a new clone form, like a brand new clone? So say we've planted Pinot Noir here in the Sierra foothills, and because of all of the difference in climate and soil and everything from where it grows natively, it's been exposed to all these factors and also UV radiation. And so what happens is because of all these stresses in the environment, it changes its DNA, and then it's in response to these pressures, and then all of a sudden it expresses its genetics differently. So that's kind of hard to wrap our head around sometimes, but you could think a lot of it like the X-Men and Deadpool. I know I have these pictures in here as kind of a funny thing, but this is very real, where these are human beings, part of the Homo sapiens, right, who have been exposed to an outside pressure, and then all of a sudden their genetics changed and mutated, and now all of a sudden they have these new abilities or new characteristics, right? So very same thing in nature with grapes as well. So this can be positive or something negative. It could be something that we really like and enjoy. And then to create more clones, think of Star Wars, right? Take a cutting off of that vine that is representing this new characteristic, take a cutting off of it, and then you propagate that. That's how you create more clones. So that's how clones kind of work. So the difference between variety versus clone. And if we have more questions about this, we can absolutely go over it in class. I know it can be a confusing topic, but we also have a really nice article here from Testarossa about grape clones if you'd like to read more about that. Cool. So characteristics of plants. Plants are amazing, and a lot of the really cool things they can do are a result of the fact that they are stuck in place. So they're not like us, and they can't just like walk over and find water, or they don't go hunting and all this stuff, right? So a lot of the strategies they have are a result of being stuck in place. So nutrient limitations, competition, excess or shortage of water, extremes in temperature, disease and pest pressure, and also lack of light all play a part into how these plants will react, why they grow the way they do, why they, develop tendrils that can grab onto things and climb for light and competition, all these wonderful things. So there's a lot that goes into that. And if you are into plant sciences, you're going to love that. It's a very interesting component of the whole plant world, but also viticulture. So it's very cool. I do want to say this little picture here is a really good example of how plants live in symbiosis with other organisms around them. So what we have here is a mycorrhizal network, which it's just joking that this is kind of like a telephone. So what this is a like a fungus that grows within the soil. They're fungi, the mycorrhizae, and they connect to the roots of plants, and they feed off the nutrients that come off of those. But it also works as a network. It's symbiotic, where it depends on these roots as hosts to survive. So it's within their best interest to make sure that this plant stays alive. It's not a parasite, right, that eventually takes over and kills something. No, it lives in a symbiotic relationship. So what this fungi does is it attaches to roots of this tree, and then it grows out and it attaches to roots of this tree, and it can communicate between the plants. It can pick up stress signals of, say, this tree had a lack of water and it was stressed, so it's sending out chemical signals and hormones that it's stressed. But this plant over here, this tree, has an excess of water or is doing just fine. So this fungus will actually work as a transport to help all of these trees. So if you're into James Cameron's Avatar and how the network of how all of the plants communicate and everything, there is some truth to that in real life. And I think that's really cool. If interested, we'll talk more about this later, especially in the viticulture class if you're signed up for Viti 303. Another way that plants use their abilities to help them is phototropism. So this is when plants bend towards light to their advantage. So you could take a pot, lay it on its side, the plant will grow up sideways, whatever it can do to orient itself for the sunlight. There's a lot more than that. That's just barely scratching the surface. But it's pretty cool. In addition to that, plants have their own methods for survival that we as animals and humans do not. So the role of fruit in a plant's life is purely to reproduce and disperse seeds. So it provides something tasty and tempting for like a bird or a bear, some kind of animal, or even humans to consume. We consume these fruits. They have seeds in them. The seeds are covered in an indigestible coating kind of compound. So they taste bad, but also that way they can survive your digestive tract. So when it comes out the other end, it's still a totally viable seed, and it gets pooped out into the soil, and then it grows into a fantastic grapevine or whatever plant it is. So that is what plants have adapted to have for survival. So, and then it comes into the viticultural component where plants will just keep producing and producing, and their goal is to produce as much fruit as possible. So we oftentimes have to drop fruit. So because the plant's first inkling is, I need to make fruit to reproduce and survive. And then our inkling is, we don't want you to produce too much fruit because you're not going to produce enough sugar and enough flavor to make delicious wine. So this is kind of where the component of dropping crop comes in. So very cool. More on grapevines. Grapevines, if you've taken my 303 class, are actually considered as structural parasites because they grow so quickly upwards, but also downwards too. So their root structure alone is could be up to 90% of the vine mass. So even though we only see a little cute little 2-arm double cordon, or even like a little head trained situation up top above the soil, below the soil is a lot more going on structurally. So they're very competitive. Their roots grow very quickly. They grow very deeply. They know how to go around rocks and compete with other roots. Very extensive kind of structure. They can persist in nutrient deficient soils. The cool thing about vines is that the crop set happens in the previous season, where the dormant buds are actually developed also in the previous season. I'll talk about this too. So I'm going to go back to this picture here. Perfect. So say, for example, this is a grapevine that has already been harvested, and it has been pruned as well. Let's look at this side, right? So the grapes grow throughout the season. So it's like up here. So it's up here. The vine has grown. The grapes are on the vine, and so are all the leaves, right? So we'll come through, we'll pick all these grapes, and then eventually we'll go into the winter season, and all of these leaves will fall off the vine, and then you'll be left with what's called canes. So it's a shoot, and then over winter, it lignifies and turns from that green bendy material to that wooden, dense lignified material. So that's when it becomes a shoot to a cane. So it's a cane. It's very hard now. You can like whip someone with it, hurt very bad. At this point, we prune, and what you can see, what's left behind on these canes, these little buds. So this is what we're referring to, where the crop set and the buds are actually programmed in the previous season. So all these buds that are left over after all the leaves fall and all the fruit is harvested, this is your next season's crop right here. So if you were just to chop all this off, you'd have no crop next year at all. So what happens is when we go through and we prune, we have to leave a couple of spurs behind with buds as well. And there's a whole calculation based off of how many tons per acre you want and how vigorous the vine is and how many growing positions there are. And that's going to be a whole nother conversation. But these buds are left over from, let's say, the end of this vintage, 2024. By the end of this year, we still have buds on the vines, and then we'll prune, and then these buds will burst in the spring of 2025 and be the 2025 vintage harvest. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and then yes, root structure can be up to 90% of the mass. Then we also have factors that can impact grapevine performance. So soil and nutrient composition. Soil is generally a combination of sand, clay, and silt. and any percentage within that could be classified as clay, silty clay loam, sandy clay loam. So just depending on the percentages of each of these components, that classifies your soil. And there's a lot of other things too. If you look at a soil map of your location, it becomes very intense. There's lots of interesting names for soil types out there, but like even if you have just decomposed granite or something, like the soil type of boger is called Boomer Sites loam, which is funny, and then which I think is a reference to the gold rush, honestly. And then there's like Cohasset clay and all other sorts of types of soil. It just depends on the history of your area and geologic time frames and stuff like that. Also, location, topography. So is your vineyard on a hillside? Is it on a valley floor? Are you next to the ocean? Are you next to a river? Are you high desert? These are all going to impact how your vines perform. Also, disease and pest pressure impacts the composition and quality of fruit as well. So what's the deal with dirt? Dirt will determine your water holding capacity, so how quickly water just flows through, how well the roots can breathe and get oxygen, whether it promotes good bacteria or good fungi or bad bacteria or fungi, beneficial insects. There's a lot of things that go into soil, and it's seen in recent years, soil is seen less of just like a place to stand on and more of its own biome now. There's been huge efforts to use pesticides and use chemicals that are safe for maintaining the good biome in the soil and not just killing everything in sight. So very similar to skincare and how we take care of ourselves now, we're not using these super crazy harsh chemicals on our skin anymore as humans, and we're using things that promote a good biome and a safe environment for all the good bacteria that's on your skin as well. So very interesting how that's changed and awesome. Here we have a picture of cover crop. It's highly beneficial for providing nutrients to the vines, but it also attracts beneficial insects to the vineyard. This is a great example of a little symbiotic relationship and kind of treating the vineyard as an entire organism and not just the vines. Here we have an example of soil content that could negatively affect your vines. So if you have soil content with way too much clay, when clay dries, it cracks, right? So the clay can actually suffocate the plants because there's a lack of air exposure for the roots. But also when it dries and it cracks, it can also damage the roots of your vine as well. So that is not ideal. Other factors that can impact your performance: climate. So having the right climate is important. Temperature, sunshine. Too much humidity can give you mildew and mold. How much rainfall you receive, wind, water availability. Microclimate is important as well. So there's the macroclimate, which is the climate of your region. And there's a microclimate, which is your vineyard. And then there's a vine climate as well, which is the humidity and heat inside the canopy of the vine. So this can affect, you want to make sure that you have adequate airflow, so that way you're not getting mildew in the clusters and in the canopy of the vine. So shading effects and humidity retention, all important things. Then there's the human decision component, whether or not you irrigate, use fertilizers, the timing of your treatments, canopy management, etc. Pruning practices, whether or not you remove leaves or drop fruit. These will all impact the performance of your grapevine. Here's a picture of this lovely lady working in the vineyard, and she's dropping fruit. This is what we talked about earlier, where the grapevine's first inclination is to produce lots of fruit for reproduction. But we have to cut back so that way there's enough of a carbohydrate balance where the vine can produce enough sugars to create a good wine. Basically, we want it to be balanced. So dropping fruit, as sad as this looks, is very normal and very critical to producing good wine. Then we also have lots of different types of viticultural practices. We have conventional farming, which typically uses integrated pest management, preventative cultural practices, and also a combination of synthetic pesticides and biological control practices. So that's just kind of the generic default, what most folks use, conventional farming. You might hear folks talk about dry farming, and that's when you do not irrigate your vineyard hardly at all. So completely dry farming, the vines can live on their own with no additional water application, and they produce, and this stresses them to produce really high quality wines as well. And I also have links to each of these things so you can learn more about it. Organic farming is grown without the use of pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, or herbicides. So there's a lot of requirements for that one, and a lot of farmers locally are actually organic, but the process to become certified on paper is very difficult from what I hear from local winemakers, so they just don't have the certification, but they just do the process. So they use a lot of like neem oil and stuff like that. So definitely, chat. If it's important to you, ask, because it might not be advertised. Then we have biodynamic farming, which is very interesting. It's a spiritual, ethical, ecological approach to agriculture. And there is a lot of legitimacy to this, absolutely. There are some things that make people giggle a little bit about like harvesting and tasting wines depending on the phases of the moon. But you can read more about it, but there's also a lot of, like I said, merit to it as well. And then the cool little reference here to biodynamic farming, the certification is Demeter. And Demeter is the Greek goddess of the harvest. So it's pretty cool, little reference there. And then this is a practice of filling goat horns with crystals and burying it in the vineyard to help give nutrients to the soil and help boost your vineyard. So we're going to do a tour with D'Agostini at Abbondanza Farms in a couple of weeks, and I'll send out the invite to you guys as well. It's for the viticulture class, but if you're interested in learning more, he is biodynamic and organic farmer locally who's going to give us a fantastic little presentation and kind of day tour at his place. That'll be fun. There's also a reason sustainable. This is one of the most popular in the area. Sustainable farming focuses on protecting the environment with a focus on aiding and expanding natural resources as well. So not just limiting what you take, but also trying to promote the area around you as well. Then we have fish-friendly farming, and this is just a sustainable certification that restores fish and wildlife habitat and improves water quality. So this is just making sure that people aren't dumping wine into rivers or lakes or anything where that habitat would be risked from those compounds. Alcohol is toxic, and wine has a pH that's so low that will completely alter the environment of these species. So it is very, very, very bad for the environment if you dump it directly into a water source. So don't do that. Okay. Also, we have factors that affect berry development and maturation. So here again, this is another picture of dropping crop or crop thinning. So that is making sure that the vine is balanced. So understand the carbohydrate demands of the vine versus the fruit versus the level of photosynthesis in the vine. So a lot of this comes from experience. It'll be hard to understand what to do for each variety because it depends on the variety and your location, your soil, until you really get some experience seeing it. Then we have extreme heat or cold climate. Berries won't ripen correctly. The sugar and acid ratio will be way off, and we'll see that on the next slide. Disease and pest pressure. This will alter composition of fruit and timing of development. So an example I have of this is dust mites. I worked at a winery where right before harvest, we were putting in a brand new paved kind of parking lot area that was right next to the vineyard. And the folks that were hired to do the job were pounding the ground to get it flat and like settled in some way. But they weren't wetting the ground before pounding, which I guess is common practice. But someone was sick and someone was cutting corners. I'm not a construction person, so I don't know exactly. But that dust that was being generated during that pounding process migrated into the vineyard, and it spread a bunch of dust mites all over the vines, and they ate all of the leaves. They destroyed all the leaves on the grapevines, And without any leaves, you have no photosynthesis. With no photosynthesis, you have no sugar in the grapes. So the whole block was completely decimated and stuck and could not mature. Those grapes were just what they were at, and we had to harvest them at what they stayed at. So it was very, very unfortunate, but a very hard lesson to learn. Then we also have the variety itself. Varieties just mature at different times, and that's why it's so important that you select varieties that are good for your region. So Chardonnay is a white variety, or green skinned, if you wanted to take the Somme route on that. It's a white wine variety. It gets harvested very early. We're harvesting it this week. Compared to Syrah, we wouldn't harvest Syrah for maybe one more month. Cabernet Sauvignon is going to be one of the last things that we harvest here in high elevation vineyards. So depending on your weather and where you live, if you live somewhere where it freezes by October, probably shouldn't plant Cab. You're going to be cutting it close. Stick with those earlier harvesting varieties, and you'll have the most success. Okay, so here's a good picture of optimal ripening in grapes. So as a grape ripens, sugars raise and acids start to diminish. When it comes time to pick, the sugar to acid ratio will provide an ideal ripeness, flavor, and color to the grapes, resulting in high quality wines. So as we'll learn in our lab, we'll measure sugar and acids and see, understand what the potential alcohol will be because of that sugar, but also looking at the acid levels, seeing if this is a sufficient ripeness of when it was picked, basically. So here we have sugar in blue rising over time as the grape ripens, and here's an actual representation of what that grape would look like. So sugar is raising, acid is depleting, and in this situation there will be an ideal ratio of flavor. This is called engustment, when compounds start to form in the skins, and you can taste this in the berries. That's why some people taste before picking. They'll go out in the vineyard and taste the grapes. Ideal color levels, ideal acid levels, and then the sugar to acid ratio. So this is like textbook, the perfect combination of chemical components before picking. So if we see the same grape under like extreme warm conditions, extreme heat, if the conditions are non-ideal, if the weather is too hot or cold, the sugar content will be out of balance with acidity, leading to unbalanced fruit. In extreme warmer conditions, the sugar will be too high, acids will be too low, and the flavors of the grape will yield dried fruit or prune-like flavors. So this can happen. So in vintages that we just see extreme heat, and what will happen is the sugar just gets pumped into the grape, and so sugar will spike, but acid takes time to deplete. So if it's too hot for too long, it's not enough time for the acid to be consumed in the grape. And so your sugar, like your bricks, will come in at 24, but your acid will still be at, say that your pH is at 2.9. It's not even at 3.0 yet. Then that's extremely acidic. That's especially for a red variety. That's not right. So, and then also the grape hasn't matured to an ideal flavor. Now it's starting to raisin, and everything's out of balance. So this is where it kind of becomes a headache for grape growers. And then a lot of intervention will have to take place once the grapes come in to make that chemically where it needs to be. But the best wines will be made from the highest quality of grapes. So we can work with this, but it will never be as good as the most optimally ripened grape. Cool. So now we have some review questions for you guys. This will help you with any quizzes that are following this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I will see you guys next time.